Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming. As Adil said, on such a miserable, wretched night with blowing a gale outside. I should warn you, I'm not a climate scientist, and I could not tell you the difference between the stratosphere and any other kind of sphere. I am a researcher into communications, and so my interest in climate change is from the point of view of how the issue of climate change is being communicated. And I'm interested in it within the context of the fact that despite the overwhelming weight of evidence that anthropogenic global warming, human-induced or human-forced climate change, is a reality, nonetheless, the issue seems to remain, if not become, increasingly controversial. And it's increasingly controversial not simply because big, powerful interests such as the fossil fuel industry are at stake in any remedial action that we need to take to address climate change, but also because there is a large and vocal climate skeptic, or if you prefer climate denial, climate contrarian movement, which has been very successful in communicating its message. And that's really what interests me, is what I'm calling communicating skepticism. How has this climate denial or climate skeptic movement been able to remain vocal, to sustain recognition, particularly on the part of the mass media, when the weight of the evidence against what it is arguing has becoming increasingly strong? So it's a kind of paradox, and I think that we have to understand why and how that message has remained so powerful if we are to move on and address the urgent and serious reality, the challenge, the threats that climate change poses. So that's what I want to talk about a little bit tonight. I'm trying to avoid what the famous Canadian economist John Kenneth Galbraith, the warning that he made about academics, which is you have to be careful about them because they can only speak in 60-minute outbursts. I'm going to really try to keep this to 10 minutes, but somebody may have to start waving the 2-minute warning at me to get me to speed up. Okay, the temperature's rising. We know that. But the temperature's also rising in terms of the controversy as well. It's becoming an increasingly heated controversy in terms of the level of acrimony and hostility between climate change realists, primarily and importantly climate change scientists, and the skeptics and deniers who are critical of them, who are promoting this message. Not so much that climate change is not a reality, but that human activity is not a significant contributor to climate change. So most of the skeptic movement does not deny that climate change exists, but they attribute climate change to natural processes rather than to human activity. So the real issue here, the real controversy, is over that anthropogenic part of anthropogenic global warming, the human-induced or the human-forced aspect. Some evidence that the temperature is rising. A recent study just published last year by the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at the University of Oxford. The title is Poles Apart. If you want to Google it, you can actually download for free the executive summary of the study. It was a study of the coverage of skeptic voices in the mainstream print media, in daily newspapers, in 6 different countries. And the significant finding of that study was that between 2007 and 2010, early 2010, the number of skeptic voices who were having access to express their views in mainstream media, particularly in the United Kingdom and the United States, the 2 Anglophone countries that were studied as part of this study, is increasing. So climate skepticism is getting more of a voice in the mainstream media, not less of one, despite the growing evidence that their views are refuted scientifically. Secondly, there's other evidence of this growing acrimony, this growing hostility between what I would call climate change realists, those who recognize climate change, anthropogenic climate change as a reality, and advocate measures, particularly measures to mitigate, to reduce the emission of greenhouse gases, and the skeptics who criticize them. At the beginning of this year, in February, Andrew Weaver, who is the Canada Research Chair in Climate Change Modelling at the University of Victoria, actually took out a lawsuit against a prominent Canadian skeptic, a former geography professor from the University of Winnipeg by the name of Dr. Tim Ball. Ball was writing regularly columns being very critical of climate change realism, particularly of climate change scientists, in a conservative online news service called the Canada Free Press. And Weaver is taking him to court over some of the comments that he made in one of the stories that, in one of the news articles that he published, that Tim Ball published in Canada Free Press, and taking him, it's a libel suit, it's not just simply taking him to court over for misleading information or whatever, it's actually a libel suit. And then earlier in 2010, in May of 2010, a number of academics, a number of scientists who were members of the United States Academy of Sciences signed an open letter decrying the way in which climate scientists were becoming the target for vitriolic personal attacks on the part of climate skeptics. So the relationship, particularly on the side of climate skeptics, is becoming more acrimonious and more hostile. The third thing, of course, were the scandals of ClimateGate and GlacierGate that occurred in 2009, just before the Copenhagen Climate Change Conference, which gave climate skeptics an opportunity to amplify their critical message of climate scientists, to accuse them of fraud, to accuse them of cooking their data, and so on. So those three things are evidence of the fact that the acrimony is increasing and that climate skeptics are remaining as vocal, if not more vocal, than they ever have. So the question, I think, that interests me certainly is, why does this skeptic message persist in the face of overwhelming scientific evidence? Well, the first thing, of course, is that climate skepticism has very powerful backing. Research that's been done into things like think tanks and climate change skeptic organizations shows that there is a trail of backing, particularly of financial backing, that can be traced back particularly to the fossil fuel industry. You may well have heard of the Koch brothers in the United States, who are big, they're billionaires, they're big players in the oil and gas industry. They have been funding the climate skeptic movement in lots of different ways now for a number of years. They also fund other conservative political causes in the United States, political and social causes. So there are strong ties of, particularly of the fossil fuel industry, to the climate skeptic movement, to climate skeptic organizations like think tanks and activist groups. But secondly, and this is true, I think, for the conservative movement generally, particularly in the United States, is that the climate denial movement, the climate skeptic movement, has also been very, very clever at integrating the use of new digital, internet-based communications media with conventional mass media. They've been more successful, certainly, than their opponents have been. So they have been much more strategic about how to use different kinds of media in an integrated, chain-like, step-by-step-like fashion. So they've simply been strategic, more strategic about how to communicate their message. A second factor that works in the favor of this message is, in a sense, there are two things here, two, in a sense, seemingly opposite factors here at work. The first is that, particularly on the part of Anglophone media, there is a very strong tradition of journalistic objectivity. The news media in countries such as the US, Britain, Australia, Canada, other predominantly English-speaking countries have a tradition on the part of journalists where there's firstly a kind of they try to maintain a fairly strict separation between reporting facts and reporting opinions. One of the things that the Reuters Institute study showed is that the real increase in skeptic voices in American and British media comes primarily in opinion columns and editorials rather than in the kind of factual news reporting. But the other aspect of this journalistic objectivity is that you give voice to both sides of a controversial issue. And in this respect, this balance, which is normally what we think of being a good thing, of being a kind of sign of the media respecting and trying to work in terms of democratic values, actually turns into a form of bias. And this is something that the climate realist movement is trying to, as it were, fight against by arguing that climate change is a reality as much as the fact that the Earth is spherical. Would we, if somebody came in here and said, or went to the local media and said, the Earth isn't round, it's flat, would they take that person seriously? And that's the argument that climate change realists are trying to make, is that the evidence now is indisputable. So there is, in fact, no need for the media to give equal access to opposing voices. Yet, nonetheless, they seem to do that. So what, in a sense, paradoxically, is normally a good thing, opening up the media to competing and controversial voices, in this case, works as a form of bias in its own right. The second change that's happening, though, in the media, which to some extent is in the opposite direction, is that the media are themselves, the news media particularly, and especially in the United States, are become more politically ideological. There has been a kind of shift from the kind of political center to the political right. And that's been, in a sense, in the US, that has been provoked to a large extent by the success of the Fox television networks, by Fox News. Fox News really doesn't pay very much lip service to this traditional value of journalistic objectivity. Fox News tends to be a campaigning kind of journalism, and it campaigns pretty much indiscriminately on the part of conservative causes. And one of those, of course, is climate change skepticism. But what the success of Fox News has done in the US, and to some extent I think similar things have happened here in Canada in the last generation or so, is that they've dragged the media to the political right as well. So the political spectrum, right, has itself also shifted to the right. So the center now of the political spectrum is more conservative today than it was a generation or 35 years ago. So the ideology of the media is also changing, and that certainly has worked in the benefit of the climate skeptic message. The last thing, though, that I want to talk about is how they've actually framed that message themselves. Just having access to the media is important, but of course, what's more important after you've got access to the media is to be able to persuade the media, convince them to frame the issues in a way that is compatible with your own particular perspective, values, and interests. And here, the climate skeptics have framed their message in a number of particularly distinct ways. Firstly, they've taken a very adversarial stance. This hostility and acrimony that I mentioned earlier is part of a deliberate strategy on the part of climate skeptics. And it's modeled upon earlier success that the tobacco lobby had in trying to resist the growing success of the anti-smoking movement in the 1970s and 1980s. Right, the model there was, again, where anti-smoking, where campaigners were able to criticize science directly. And that was something of a new thing, right? Up until the 1980s, science itself, particularly natural science, was generally politically sacrosanct from criticism. But what the tobacco lobby did in the interests of resisting the anti-smoking movement, again, a lobby funded by the big tobacco companies, was begin to attack science, and they coined the term, which climate skeptics have taken over, junk science, claiming that a lot of the climate change science is junk science. But they also began to engage in personalized attacks against scientists, to criticize their moral character, to criticize their true motivations, to criticize the fact that they too were being funded by big powerful interests. So a lot of the arguments that the climate realists have been making against the climate skeptics are arguments that the climate skeptics are now mirroring back to the climate realists, and that's one of them. Look, you're being backed, you're being funded by big interests too. Whether those interests are the alternative energy industry, solar and wind power, whether those interests are big government that in a sense has some kind of inherent interest in increasing its control over people, and particularly its control over industry. And these attacks, as I said, become more adversarial, they become more personalized. The second thing, though, is that the climate skeptics also, in a sense, wrap themselves in the flag of victimhood. It's a very strong theme that runs through a lot of climate skepticism, is we're being unfairly treated. We're being shut out of the kind of scientific forums where we can be the true scientists, because true scientists, of course, are by definition skeptical. So part of their argument is we're being victimized by climate scientists. Climate scientists won't listen to our arguments. They say the evidence is now indisputable. That's not a true scientific position to take, because any true scientist will always be skeptical about the evidence. So that's the second part of how they're framing their argument, is making themselves out to be, as it were, vulnerable parties in this struggle, in this conflict, who are being victimized by their opponents, the climate realists. The third thing that they do is to accentuate the risks and the costs of addressing climate change. What they say is, so if this is true, that human beings are responsible for climate change, then what are the costs and what are the risks of addressing it in the way that climate realists are advocating? Right? What are the costs and risks? And the fourth thing here that makes those costs and risks, as it were, more poignant in their message, is that really what the evidence suggests is at best a situation of uncertainty and doubt. So do you want to sacrifice all of the benefits of an industrial, affluent society, having a car to drive, having a house to heat, and so on? Do you want to sacrifice those things for something that is shrouded still in uncertainty and doubt? And what that points to, I think, is the kind of advantage that any kind of activist has if they are resisting rather than promoting change. And that's what, of course, climate skeptics are doing, is that they're not trying to bring about change. They're trying to say things are fine the way they are. And when you're trying to resist change rather than promote it, you don't actually have to convince people of your cause. Climate skeptics don't actually have to convince people that global warming is a myth, or that the anthropogenic part is a myth. All that they need to do to make their message strong, to make their message resonant, is to simply say, we can't be sure. It's uncertain, it's doubtful what the reality is. And that is partly why I think, at the end, their message still resonates. Because that message is not one that's asking people to believe in their cause, it's simply asking people to remain doubtful about what their opponents are saying. Thank you very much.
Our next panelist is Lucilla Spini, and our little known fact about Lucilla this evening is that she's a scatterling, which means that she's a fan of Johnny Clegg. And a friend, actually. So, first of all, allow me to thank Sarah and Corinne for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here to discuss climate change. It's happening. But also allow me to thank a person that we all have to thank, because she's done an amazing job in organizing these and other events, and is Catherine Pizzacalla. Is she somewhere around here? She's probably finding a chair. Thank you. So Sarah was mentioning some questions that we had to address in this panel. And let me start with the first question. What are we using as evidence of climate change? And here I'm just saying it's happening. So I'm just going to not touch on skepticism or anything like that. But what I would like to say is that what are we using as evidence? Some of you probably were last time at the panel on politics of policymakers. I'm sure Dr. Alex Bilek was there, and he's here. He was one of the speakers. And we had lots of discussion. What is evidence? And there were like many different definitions, and very broad definitions sometimes. And so I would like to take this opportunity to actually zoom in a particular topic, and a very tangible topic, because climate change can manifest its being in many different ways to different people. So let's focus on a particular topic, on a very extreme topic, and that of extreme events. And allow me to frame this within a very, very recent special report on managing the risks of extreme events and disaster to advance climate change adaptation. This is a special report of the IPCC, also known as SREX. This is the new acronym in IPCC jargon. And actually, the summary for policymakers is currently available. The actual report will be launched in February, but on the website you could actually already find some information and videos and other fact sheets on this report. So the quote that allow me to use the extreme events as evidence of climate change is the following. A changing climate leads to changes in the frequency, intensity, spatial extent, duration, and time of extreme weather and climate events, and can result in unprecedented extreme weather and climate events. But let me depict it, it's easier. And we see this image always on TV, unfortunately, these days. Here are two snapshots which are depicting extreme water-related events. Too much water on one side, this is slums in India after flooding. And on the other side, too little water dropped in Africa. And this is actually the picture of used for this event. So as you can see in the picture, extreme events are not just events. Extreme may actually have an impact on people, men and women, on their health, on their well-being, on their livelihood. And sometimes these events can actually become disasters. So, as an anthropologist, as well as within my role of executive officer, the Global Environmental Change and Human Health, an initiative promoting and fostering international network research on global environmental change and human health, I will give you an overview on how we can apply such knowledge and a little bit of international political context in this respect. But first of all, allow me to say that this knowledge is actually an outcome of interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research and assessment, as the research that I mentioned before within the Global Environmental Change and Human Health, or what I mentioned before, the IPCC assessment. In fact, the SREX report is actually an endeavor which was carried out by many different experts in physical climate system, on impacts of climate change, on managing disasters. And actually, some of you might have met one of these experts, Chris Abai, which was another speaker at another drop series. So, from this multidisciplinary and transdisciplinary research and assessment, what kind of application you can have? You can have an adaptation, measures on risk management, and humanitarian relief when the extreme events actually become a disaster, and that's what you usually see on TV. And there's some organization actually, and some initiative, international initiative, working and applying this knowledge towards adaptation, risk management, and humanitarian relief. Allow me to quote some. The Adaptation Fund, for example, the Help Desk for Integrated Flood Management of the Associated Program on Flood Management, a joint initiative of the World Meteorological Organization and the Global Water Partnership. But also the International Committee of the Red Cross, they have a special unit for water and habitat. And also the last logo there is the Focus Humanitarian Assistant of the Aga Khan Development Network, which actually has its headquarters in Toronto. And they look at the different spectrum of extreme events and disaster management. How does this fit within national and international political position? This is quite a complex issues. We see people, we see water, we see environment, climate change, extreme events of different types. So this does not usually fit in the silos of the political arena. However, there's some exception also in the international frameworks. There are multi-sectoral forums. And hence I would like to bring to your attention one example of multi-sectoral dialogue, which is the Protocol on Water and Health to the '92 Convention on the Protection and Use of Transboundary Watercourses and International Lakes. This convention and the protocol are pan-European agreements. Pan-European in the United Nations system also means include North America, hence Canada and United States, even if I have to say Canada has not ratified this protocol. But what I would like to align here in this context, that this protocol brings together water and health, but also recently they've been working on the development guidance on water supply and sanitation in extreme weather events. So using that knowledge coming from multidisciplinary and transdisciplinary research towards advising countries, contracting parties of the protocol, how to deal with water supply and sanitation extreme weather events. And so this is just a sort of a brief overview, but this protocol is an excellent example of applying knowledge of climate change and related extreme into a political context, addressing environment, water, and health and well-being through an integrated approach towards human health and well-being for all, whether they experience floods or drought or other extreme events, which are all evidence of climate change. Thank you.
Thank you, Latilla. Next up, we have Dr. Quinlan from York University, whose little piece of trivia is that he hates wearing ties and normally only ever does it for weddings or funerals.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. Even though I work in Toronto, I am a Hamiltonian. I live in Hamilton. The lakes you see just beyond the Kelsey sign there, that is the high school I went to. The apartment building you can see right there, that is the apartment building I lived in when I was in preschool. So it's a great pleasure to be here talking to a Hamilton audience. I should go to the next presentation. How do I go to that? Oh, I see.
Got it?
Ooh. My apologies. So I'm going to talk about one line of evidence for recent climate change. Quite a bit of the research I am involved in is what's called paleoclimate research, where we try to reconstruct past changes in climate. So as a line of evidence for this hypothesis of anthropogenically induced recent climate warming, is this a reliable line of evidence? To answer that question, well, you're going to hear different things from different people. It depends on who you ask. Here is what's called the hockey stick graph. This is probably the most famous paleoclimate reconstruction that people are aware of. This is a graph from the IPCC report, authored by Mann and colleagues, where what you see is a paleoclimate reconstruction over the past 1,000 years, showing fairly steady global or northern hemisphere temperatures until we reach the 20th century, in which we see matching with the measured record unprecedented warming. Now, this is a very maligned figure. It has been criticized most famously by McIntyre-McKittrick, but this is based largely on statistical approaches to produce this graph. It's worth noting that at the end of this whole debate about the validity of this hockey stick, some of the variation here has changed, but the big picture has not. We are seeing temperature changes in the 20th century unprecedented over the timescale of the last millennia. So for those of you who are not aware of paleoclimate changes, the way this type of data is produced is by looking out into the world today and seeing a relationship between some modern day variable and climate. And in this case, a lot of this graph is based on what are called tree ring widths, where there's a relationship between, let's say, temperature and tree growth, or precipitation and tree growth. So the idea here is if there's a current relationship between climate and some sort of thing we can measure, if we can find fossil evidence of that measure, well then we can extend back in time our ideas of how climate has changed in the past. That's paleoclimate science in 30 seconds. So I'm a biologist, and a lot of the proxies used in paleoclimate reconstructions are biological indicators, and there's an underlying biological relationship between your fossil indicator of interest and climate. And so within this framework, there's an assumption that, well, we assume that there's a relationship between a variable and climate, and there's at some point in this relationship where it can fall apart, where the principle of uniformitarianism no longer holds. So there's a part in this record where the authors argue that one of the proxies being used, an ecological or biological threshold has been crossed, and this biological climate relationship no longer holds, so this data was removed. But as been mentioned, this idea of media spin starting to dominate our discussion on climate change science, rather than it's being accepted as a normal part of climate science where we do not use data which no longer fits the assumptions behind which climate science operates. It's instead been marketed as some sort of conspiracy to hide data that does not fit some fraudulent method of fraudulent hypothesis of recent climate change. So there's been undue attention focused on this one hockey stick, but records of hockey stick changes continue to accumulate over time. This is an example from 2009 Kaufman looking at changes in the Arctic, where you see here, this is a 2,000-year record, and you see right here a hockey stick change in the last century, and on a paleoclimate reconstruction based on tree paleoclimate records, lake paleoclimate records, and ice paleoclimate records. And you see here what we believe to be changes in the last 2,000 years about solar inputs in the Arctic. So, something to get out of this graph is that, yes, the sun is important for determining some aspect of climate. No climate scientist has ever said otherwise. As a first-year university student, I remember the graphs in the textbook showing the relationship between, for example, orbital cycles and climate over a timescale of thousands of years. So, yes, there is an influence of the sun on climate. However, what's happening over the last 100 years, what we are observing with climate over the last 100 years, is not matched by what we are seeing with a climate forcer such as the sun. Here we have the output from this figure where we see here a model developed that relates climate to inputs of energy to the Earth from the sun, and we see a pretty good relationship. And when it's reconstructed over this 2,000-year record, we see the last 100 years sticking out as this huge anomaly. So there's been a breakdown in the sun-climate relationship over the last 100 years. So from records like this, using paleoclimate as a line of evidence, it's, I think, quite compelling that the type of temperature changes we're seeing are unprecedented, not just on the scope of the last several hundred years or the last 1,000 years, but many thousands of years. Because a lot of paleoclimate records from the sediments of lakes and ponds extend over many thousands of years. So reconstructing past climate from the sediments of lakes and ponds, this is a discipline called Paleolimnology, where limnology is the study of lakes, and paleolimnology is the study of past lake environments. So my research specialty is paleolimnology. Now over many years, I've tried to explain to my mother a number of times what it is I do. I don't think I can get much more into that in the few minutes I have with you. But some things I want to say are that there are, if we think of Canada as a landscape, if we think of the Arctic as a landscape, there are tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of lakes and ponds across these vast landscapes. So we have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of records of past environmental change where they're like pages in a book of the history of the Earth, and it's just a matter of us collecting more and more data to try to figure out what the history of the Earth is in terms of the environment. And the evidence continues to accumulate that we're seeing over the last century unprecedented changes in Arctic ecosystems on a time scale of thousands of years. Just some examples. From the Canadian Arctic, we see unprecedented changes in a type of algae called diatoms. They're unprecedented on a time scale of hundreds of years to up to 1,000 years, depending on the date of the bottom of this sediment core. We have here a record from Ellesmere Island, where we have the sudden appearance of algae in a pond in the 20th century, where it's been absent for the last 3,000 or 4,000 years. And we have also, because we have lakes and ponds across the entire landscape, we can also study sites that we can use as what we would call experimental controls. Like, for example, here in Labrador, northern Quebec, where we know from the temperature record, we know from the actual measured record, that this part of the world has not warmed much at all in the 20th century because of an influx of fresh water from this increased rate of melt of snow and ice, such that this part of Canada has not warmed. This is also a site which is closest to humans, and stressors or impacts such as pollution, contamination, deposition of chemicals that would act as fertilizers to these ecosystems, and we see here flat line changes. All right, so this would be a site that you'd think would be most impacted by human influences other than recent climate warming, and yet it shows no change at all compared to sites much further north where you see huge changes over the last 100 years. So the most important part about paleoclimate as a line of evidence is that these records span thousands of years. I had a graphic here, I don't know why, I guess I must have lost it, where there's Axford et al. Looks at a record spanning the last 200,000 years from the Canadian Arctic here on northern Baffin Island. So because these records span thousands of years, we can get past this human horizon of when humans began to mess with the atmosphere. So as a case in point, I'd like to point out to you the sea ice record, where the sea ice record, the best sea ice record out there only goes back till the late 70s. So recently there was this brouhaha in the media where you can see here just a few years ago the extent of sea ice recovered from a low. So you heard a lot in the media about, oh, those climate scientists are wrong. It's all a fraud. And look, we have the data to prove it. What a bunch of liars. And then, in 2011, when sea ice once again hit historical minima, you heard crickets chirping. Okay, so with situations like this, I don't have really any doubt at all that climate science has been politicized. So even if climate realists win the day, you can still have climate change denialists say, well, it doesn't matter anyways because the sea ice record only goes back to the 70s and we've been messing with the atmosphere the last 150 years. Well, this doesn't mean anything anyways, so we win anyways, haha. Well, with paleoclimate, going back thousands of years, we don't have to deal with such issues. Oh, there it is. Sorry. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Roberto. Last but not least, we have Dr. Thomas, who is a big football fan.
Football means soccer to me. Thank you all for coming. It's nice to see so many mature people in the audience. Not that the students that are here are immature, but you know what I mean. Some of you might have been here when the first major conference on climate change actually took place in Toronto in 1988. It was the World Conference on Changing Atmosphere. That conference came up with the goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 20% by the year 2005. A very bold and very silly goal, as we now know, because that's been way surpassed. And also since 1992, the UNFCCC, the Framework Convention for Climate Change, has been trying to establish targets for emissions and timetables. Has that resulted in any solution to the problem? No, it hasn't. So I would want to argue in this short piece that we need to look at other ways of solving this problem. First, I'd like to go back to a little bit of what Graham was alluding at, but this is even within the realist spheres. We have the evidence, you can work on the statistics, you can make it sound, but people will still use that evidence to suit their points of view. Look at this graph that shows you 3 different ways of looking at carbon emissions. If you're from a developing country, you'll probably favor that middle graph, which is the historic emissions over time, showing that the major emitters have been the European Union and the United States of America. If you're a politician from the US, you may want to favor the left and right forms of this data. China is now the major problem. We have to attack China. Let's get China to do something. Or what about those people in the Gulf area? Look at them. On a per capita basis, they are the ones that are emitting the most greenhouse gases. So you can use the data and evidence, and it is being used in ways that favor the particular position that you're taking. This means that as scientists in the scientific community, we have to be quite careful to make sure that the way the data is being presented is legitimate and is fair. And there's still many debates going on about how to do that. Secondly then, when the IPCC was formed, they focused on trying to nail the problem as a global problem. And yet we all know that climate change issues revolve around all these different factors you see at the top of this graph. What happened, however, was a concentration on the global change issue, looking at it through the lens of the global circulation models. This is what the IPCC was set up to do. They did a fantastic job. It's one of the best examples of how an international organization can come together and produce evidence-based information that can inform policymakers. But even through that narrow lens, there was a tendency to externalize the human factors, and suddenly there was this top-down goal set for we must keep warming below 2 degrees. There's no real scientific basis for choosing 2 degrees. The pressure out there was to put something out that policymakers could get around. This basically resulted in overgeneralization of the science. And that's created a number of problems. We had this top-down goal of 2 degrees set. This implies that the problem needs to be attacked from the global down to the national and levels before that, below that. When in fact things happen the other way around. They go from the local to the national and then up to the global. This is an issue of where a popularized orthodoxy, the 2-degree figure, has resulted in diverting attention away from appropriate policy making that should be grounded in more local issues with respect to climate variability. When you work in countries, developing countries, you start to talk about global change, you just glazed over looks. What people are coping with day to day is climate variability. And in the drylands that I specialize in, they've been coping with this for thousands of years. We need to learn the lessons about how those people are coping with climate variability. Use that information to inform policymakers at the national and regional levels, and then up to the global level. I'm not saying that organizations like the UNFCCC are totally useless, but you've seen the results of 20 years. The problem has not been solved, and it's getting more acute, particularly in areas where the climate variability means basically survival or not. And then we need to look at it in a much broader framework. Climate change, like other major environmental problems of loss of biodiversity, water and land degradation, are basically development, environmental and security issues. All of those undermine economic growth, poverty, livelihoods, human health, personal, national and regional security. We can argue then what one needs to view those problems in a much broader vision of how they affect human vulnerability. This requires a focus on the socioeconomic factors, the resilience of your ecosystem, and the institutional capacity to respond, not necessarily at a global or international level, but more importantly, first at a national level. You can see from this graph that where we are tending to be is there. Very limited socioeconomic assets, fragile ecosystems, low institutional capacity to respond to the crisis. Where we want to go is the other side of this cube. Robust agroecosystems, high institutional capacity to respond to the crisis. That can include organizations like the UNFCCC, and also building up socioeconomic assets. So it's quite wrong to divorce climate change from the usual suite of development problems that we're faced with. Part of the problem has been the bandwagon of climate change has diverted attention from the factors that will help us solve climate change, and at the same time help us solve the development, environmental problems and security issues that we now face. This means that we have to think about new means of working together at different levels. Some have suggested that it's time to forget the UNFCCC after the fiasco of the Copenhagen meeting, and that it's much better to just get the 12 major emitting countries together, get them to work on policies that can stimulate things like technological innovations, that can stimulate exchange and transfer of this information to developing countries, that can, if you like, set up clubs of people who can get action going in a much, much shorter time than the UNFCCC, which is, as I mentioned, been in existence for 20 years. Thank you.